Hello kids, this is Mr. Whistler with your video lesson of the day. And today we're going to be talking about the women's rights movement. Alright, the women were out in society and they were helping with the temperance movement and they were helping with education reform and they were helping with the abolitionists when they noticed that they didn't have equal rights. So many women who fought to end slavery began to recognize their own bondage and formed the women's rights movement. Their goal was to improve women's lives and to win equal rights. Many of the women reformers were Quakers. Now, Quakers believed that everybody was created equal, and they kind of lived this part of their religion, and their women were treated that way as well. So Quaker women had a certain amount of equality in their communities that other women did not. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was one of the pioneers for women's rights. So in 1848, Elizabeth Stanton organized the first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York. 200 women were present and 40 men attended, and I believe Frederick Douglass was one of the men who were there. Now, during this convention, the women issued a declaration of sentiments and resolutions, and it was modeled after the Declaration of Independence. The Women's Declaration called for an end to all laws that discriminated against women. Elizabeth Stanton thought their declaration should contain something about suffrage, but others thought it too radical. Now, during this time period, the idea of women voting was ridiculous. If you went into a gathering of men and talked about getting women the right to vote, they would have laughed you out of the room. And the women, for whatever reason, kind of accepted this and kind of believed it themselves. The women at the convention, when Elizabeth Stanton mentioned this, they commented, they said, "Lizzie, we can't put that in there. They won't take us seriously." Well, Frederick Douglass, I believe, was the one who convinced them to include it. He said, if you guys are serious about this and you want equal rights, then you have to include that. So they ended up including it, and suffrage became the most controversial issue at the convention. Now here's the declarations of rights and sentiments. Now I'm going to read this, and I want you to focus on how close it is copied from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. Whenever any form of government becomes too destructive of these rights, it is the right of those who suffer from it to refuse allegiance to it and to insist upon the institution of a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Now, if you look at the bolded part right here, this is exactly what it says in the Declaration of Independence, except they added, and women. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. I think it copies the Declaration all the way down to happiness. That they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, in our essay that we wrote, at the end of it, we talked about what the government's job was. The government's job is to protect our rights. And if the government is not doing its job, it's our duty, the people's duty, to change or abolish the government. That's how we said it. They're basically saying the same thing. they say it in different words. That to secure these rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, governments are instituted. So to secure means to get these rights, governments are created, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed or the people. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these rights and they're not doing their job, it's the right of those who suffer from it to refuse allegiance to it and to insist upon the institution of a new government. If they're not doing their job, it's our duty to change or abolish the government. So, upon which document was the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments modeled? The answer is the Declaration of Independence. All right, now here's another quote. This one's kind of interesting. It says, resolved that it is the duty of the women of this country to secure themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. So you got to ask yourself, what does this quote say? Resolved that the duty of the women of this country to secure themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. All right, the key word right here is elective. So we might not know what franchise means, but this is something we can recognize. Duty we recognize. It's their job. It's the job of these women to secure themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. A lot of kids today caught on to that pretty quickly and said, well, it's their duty to get the right to vote, which is correct. Well, the question on this one is a little bit difficult because it says, using the quote above, what did women hope to secure? That part's easy, the right to vote. And why was it important to secure it? Well, I don't know if we can get from this quote why it was important to secure the right to vote. You know, it talks about their duty or their job to get it. It talks about it being a sacred right, but it doesn't really say why it's important. Well, why it's important for the women to get their vote is for the same reason that the men have their vote. Why did everybody go up in arms against the British when we had no representation in Parliament? They were making laws for us and we had no say. So it's important for the women to get the right to vote, or the women to get suffrage, so they have a say in the laws that they have to follow. So using the quote above, what did women hope to secure? The right to vote. And why was it important to secure it? So that women could actually have a say in the laws they must obey. So there's how you kind of break down these quotes and figure out the questions from them. All right, the historical significance of the Seneca Falls Convention was, it was the beginning of the women's rights movement. Another Quaker, Susan B. Anthony, worked for women's rights and temperance. She fought for equal pay for women, college for girls, and coeducation. One thing that you guys need to realize is that women were discriminated against in the workplace for years. Men and women would do the same job, and women would always get paid less. So these women in the women's rights movement tried to fight against that. In 1851, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton met at a temperance meeting and became lifelong friends. So for the next century, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were the leaders in the women's rights movement. All right, here is your notebook. It's called Women in Reform. I want you to create a bubble map and include all the things that we talked about for the women's rights movement. I want you to write and answer these questions. I want you to draw this picture. It says, in 1980, the United States government created a dollar with Susan B. Anthony on the front. create a coin with both Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton on the coin. And I want you to use the bubble map in this section and write an essay about the women's rights movement. That's it, kids, and have a great day.